Bob Lazar stunned the world in the late 1980s with claims that he had worked on alien spacecraft in the US military's legendary top-secret facility, Area 51. Whilst logic tells us that his tales are preposterous, just enough fragments of evidence have kept his story alive for over 30 years. In a May 1989 interview with investigative reporter George Knapp on Las Vegas TV station KLAS, under the pseudonym Dennis and with his face hidden, Lazar detailed his work at S4, a secret facility he claimed exists near the Nellis Air Force Base installation known as Area 51. According to Lazar, aircraft hangars built into the side of mountains housed alien craft that had been captured or crashed. His work involved reverse engineering these ships to gain scientific knowledge of how they operated. Giving a second interview that November, unmasked and as himself, he said he worked for the US Navy via defense contractor EG&G. The company immediately said that they had no record of him working for them. Lazar went on to describe the propulsion systems of the alleged alien craft. He said they used antimatter, fueled by the chemical element with atomic number 115. This element had not been named at the time of Lazar's interview, but was later synthesized in 2003 and named moscovium. The resulting energy, according to Lazar, would propel the craft through a gravity distortion field. He additionally claimed to have read documents proving that Earth had been visited for 10,000 years by aliens from the star system Zeta Reticuli. However, no planets have yet been found in that system. A further claim that he had seen an alien specimen in a lab was withdrawn in later years. Lazar's assertion that he had a master's degree in physics from MIT and in electronic technology from Caltech were both disputed by the universities, as was his claim to have worked at Area 51. His credibility seemed to be non-existent. Then, just as his story looked to be falling apart, one other discredited claim, that he had worked as a physicist at Los Alamos, suddenly reignited interest. There's lots more to come in this video, but please consider liking, subscribing to the channel, and sharing. KLAS TV found the name Lazar Robert in a 1982 Los Alamos National Laboratory phone directory, but the laboratory repeatedly denied having any records on him. All of a sudden, Lazar's claim that he had been scrubbed from official records for speaking out sounded a little more plausible. If he could establish an attempt to discredit him, the obvious question would be, what did he know that the US military and government went to such lengths to cover up? Continuing interest in Lazar revealed more about the man himself. In 1990, he pleaded guilty to pandering after being arrested during an investigation into a prostitution ring. In addition to 150 hours community service, he was ordered to undergo psychotherapy. In 2006, a company he operates, United Nuclear Scientific Equipment and Supplies, which sells a variety of materials and chemicals, was charged with violating the Federal Hazardous Substances Act for shipping restricted chemicals across state lines. A guilty plea resulted in a $7,500 fine. In 2017, Lazar's workplace was raided by the FBI and local police, which Lazar theorizes was to recover element 115, a substance that he says he took from a government lab. Records obtained through a Freedom of Information request show the raid was part of a murder investigation. The enduring story of Bob Lazar seems to have three possibilities: that he is being truthful, that he is being untruthful, or that the US military tacitly support his and other claims, as UFO stories help them obscure what really goes on at top-secret facilities. Lazar still has supporters, and his claims find a fair hearing on platforms such as the Joe Rogan podcast. He admits he has no evidence. The likelihood is that his claims are fabricated, but the passage of time may have made that irrelevant. In the same way that new generations are no longer interested in the Kennedy assassination, they are also increasingly disinterested in UFOs. As society becomes more self-obsessed by the day, many are uninterested in other humans, let alone extraterrestrials. But Bob Lazar provided us with a tantalizing story that was of its time. In the lead up to the millennium, with all its prophecies of doom or fulfillment, he captured the imagination with a tale of visiting aliens and their amazing technology. And if, for a moment, he made people think outside of their narrow box, then it hardly even matters if it was true. George Galloway has been one of the most colourful figures in British politics since the 1980s. His career, in which he has been a Member of Parliament for more than one party, has been punctuated by controversy, fallouts, and memorable moments, far too many to detail in one video. But his appearance in May 2005 before the United States Senate Committee on Homeland Security stands out as one of the most compelling pieces of political theatre in recent times. Galloway had long been a supporter of the cause of Arab nationalism and a fierce critic of Western foreign policy in the region. In 1994, following the First Gulf War, and while he was still a sitting Labour MP, he travelled to meet Saddam Hussein. He gave a much criticised address to the Iraqi dictator, appearing to praise his strength and indefatigability, although Galloway asserted that his remarks were addressed to the Iraqi people via Saddam. The events that led to the Senate Committee confrontation unfolded after the 2003 American and British invasion of Iraq that toppled Saddam. On the 22nd of April that year, the Daily Telegraph published documents found by its journalist, David Blair, in the ruins of the Iraqi Foreign Ministry. They purported to show that Galloway had received $375,000 a year from the Iraqi regime that had been diverted from the country's Oil for Food program, a mechanism that provided basic necessities to Iraq while they were under crippling sanctions. Galloway completely denied the allegations, questioned the authenticity of the documents and the motives behind their discovery, and sued the paper for libel. The case began in the High Court on the 14th of November 2005. The Daily Telegraph offered a public interest rather than a justification defence, effectively admitting that the story was untrue. However, Justice David Eadie ruled that the article had been seriously defamatory, as it used words about the politician such as treason, in Saddam's pay, and Saddam's little helper. Galloway was awarded substantial damages and costs. Despite his apparent vindication, similar allegations emerged again just 6 months later. A May 2005 report issued by the Senate Permanent Committee on Investigations alleged that Galloway, amongst other European politicians, had personally profited from the sale of oil in the Oil for Food program, to the tune of 20 million barrels. It further claimed that the Mariam Appeal, a campaign set up by Galloway to treat an Iraqi child with leukemia and to protest UN sanctions, had been a front for the laundering of oil for food money through donations from an Iraqi businessman, Fawaz Zurikat. The report used as its source Tariq Aziz and Taha Yassin Ramadan, the former foreign minister and deputy prime minister in Saddam's Iraq. Both men had surrendered to US forces and, under interrogation, had made a series of incendiary claims. Galloway, pointing to his vindication in the courts and a Charity Commission investigation that found no financial impropriety in the Mariam Appeal, dismissed the report. He claimed that US pro-war politicians were trying to distract attention from rampant sanctions busting by US corporations and the theft of billions of dollars of Iraqi wealth in the aftermath of the invasion. Seeking a right of reply, Galloway arranged to appear before the Senate committee. Upon arriving in the US, he dismissed his bête noire, Republican Senator for Minnesota and Committee Chair Norm Coleman, as, quote, a pro-war neocon hawk and the lickspittle of George W. Bush. The stage was set for televised political pyrotechnics. There's lots more to come in this video, but please consider liking, subscribing to the channel, and sharing. After the legal formalities, Galloway was allowed an opening statement. He unleashed a verbal volley with both barrels, and the US senators, accustomed to forelock-tugging deference, were visibly taken aback. When challenged on his meeting twice with Saddam Hussein, Galloway had this reply.
As a matter of fact, I've met Saddam Hussein exactly the same number of times as Donald Rumsfeld met him. The difference is, Donald Rumsfeld met him to sell him guns and to give him maps, the better to target those guns. I met him to try and bring about an end to sanctions, suffering, and war, and on the
responding to the documents purporting to show his wrongdoing, Galloway was unyielding.
Now, you have nothing on me, Senator, except my name on lists of names from Iraq, many of which have been drawn up after the installation of your puppet government in Baghdad. If you had any of the letters against me that you had against Zhirinovsky and even Pasqua, they would have been up there in your slideshow for the members of your committee today.
And attacking the testimony of high-level Iraqi detainees, he sought to cause maximum embarrassment to US authorities.
In these circumstances, knowing what the world knows about how you treat prisoners in Abu Ghraib prison, in Bagram Air Base, in Guantanamo Bay, including, I may say, British citizens being held in those places. I'm not sure how much credibility anyone would put on anything you managed to get from a prisoner in those circumstances.
At every turn, the British MP tried to contrast the allegations of the committee with the then increasingly unpopular Iraq War.
Senator, this is the mother of all smokescreens. You are trying to divert attention from the crimes that you supported, from the theft of billions of dollars of Iraq's wealth. Have a look at the real oil for food scandal. Have a look at the 14 months you were in charge of Baghdad, the first 14 months, when $8.8 billion of Iraq's wealth went missing on your watch. Have a look at Halliburton and the other American corporations that stole not only Iraq's money, but the money of the American taxpayer.
After dealing with Coleman's questions, Galloway was then questioned by the slightly less hostile Senator Carl Levin. Nevertheless, it still became a heated exchange.
Opposed this oil for food program.
There's a lot of things you oppose, but you don't believe should be circumvented in illegal ways, isn't that?
Well, please, Senator, you supported the illegal attack on Iraq. Don't talk to me about illegality.
Sorry about that, I didn't. But that's beside the point.
Well,
That's beside the point. You're wrong on your facts.
I'm collectively
Yeah.
talking about the Senate, not you personally.
Well, it's okay. That's all right. Let me go back to my question. I don't want to get.
Why
I don't want to get
brush that
involved. I
aside,
don't want to get
Senator?
involved in.
Why not? You want to talk about illegality?
No.
You launched an illegal war which has killed 100,000 people.
Let's try.
You want me to be troubled about?
No, I
somebody
want you to
paying a
answer.
kickback?
I want you to answer questions which are fairly
All right.
put and directly put
All right.
to you.
All right.
Now I'll
And
ask
with
you. one
that, the session wrapped up. But the theatre of Galloway's appearance made news broadcasts and headlines on both sides of the Atlantic and increased his profile significantly. In a final report, the Senate committee doubled down on their accusations and added to them, claiming that Galloway had, quote, knowingly made false or misleading statements under oath. The British politician challenged them to charge him with perjury and claimed Coleman's motive for the perjury accusation was revenge for being embarrassed by him. George Galloway is not everyone's cup of tea, and certainly not the establishment's. But his appearance in Washington was an instant classic, and he is rare among politicians for standing up for what he believes in, whether you agree with him or not. The Battle of Goose Green took place on the 28th and 29th of May, 1982, during the Falklands War between Britain and Argentina. Goose Green was a settlement on East Falkland, the more populated of the two islands. It had an airstrip and was close to San Carlos Water, where the British task force had landed in its attempt to retake the Falklands. It ultimately played a large role in the outcome of the conflict, yet the decision to attack Goose Green was controversial. Argentine forces were concentrated heavily around the capital, Port Stanley. British military planners noted that the Goose Green force was dug in defensively and posed little offensive threat to the British advance towards the capital. Their strategy was to surround and neutralize the enemy position, and instead directly assault Port Stanley. However, the military were coming under heavy pressure from the British government to deliver a headline-grabbing victory that would firmly establish momentum. British ships had sustained damage and loss from Argentine air attacks, and while the military calculation still favoured the British, the political calculation was foremost in the government's mind. An attack on Goose Green posed problems. The terrain was rolling, treeless and grassy. In addition to having no cover, the ground would be boggy during the South Atlantic winter. The Argentine forces, known as Task Force Mercedes, were entrenched in well-chosen areas and had set up fields of fire. They also had air defence batteries and howitzers. Close air support was in nearby Stanley. In total, the defenders had 1,083 men, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Italo Piaggi. Some of the men were commando trained, but the majority were basically trained conscripts. Morale remained high, however, helped by a recent airdrop of supplies. On the 25th of May, Brigadier Julian Thompson, the ground forces commander, was ordered to mount an attack on Argentine positions around Goose Green and the nearby settlement of Darwin. Thompson ordered the 2nd Battalion of the Parachute Regiment to initially attack south of the settlement before the main attack came from the north. The battalion, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Herbert H. Jones, had been told by HQ that they were up against 3 infantry companies, but an SAS survey suggested there was only 1. Jones chose to believe the SAS report and consequently was much more aggressive in his mindset, believing he could win the battle in the first attack. Straight away there were problems. The BBC had broadcast a report stating that the Paras were to attack Goose Green, and the Argentines, not surprisingly, were listening in. Despite that, In the initial contact, before daybreak on the 28th of May, the Argentines were forced to regroup, and A and B companies of the Parachute Regiment gained ground. At about 7:30 a.m., the Argentinians counterattacked from Darwin Hill, between the attackers and Goose Green, halting the British advance with a mix of small arms and artillery fire. Now it became clear that Jones' strategy was not the right one. The British were outmanned and outgunned on Darwin Hill, and were forced to fall back to a gorse line below it. Jones, accompanied by others, decided to charge the positions, but was killed by enemy fire. Command passed to Major Chris Keeble. Now in mid-morning full daylight, he chose to reorganize the attack, pumping around 1,000 rounds of mortar fire into Darwin Hill. There's lots more to come in this video, but please consider liking, subscribing to the channel, and sharing. An Argentine Air Force support strike that foggy morning was a complete fiasco. Part of their fire was on their own positions, and they were engaged by their own anti-aircraft units, who assumed they were being attacked by British planes. In the end, the Argentines held Darwin Hill for over 6 hours, finally cleared out by around 1:30 p.m. Following this, C and D companies of the Paras moved on the airfield and schoolhouse building in Goose Green. C Company was immediately bombarded by 35mm anti-aircraft guns and took heavy casualties, but with sustained mortar and missile fire, the Argentines were again forced to abandon positions and retreat. This time, large numbers of the Argentine 12 platoon were overrun and forced to surrender. D Company got into a firefight at the airfield, which was also the scene of the infamous white flag incident. According to the British, someone waved a white flag on the Argentine side, and when Lieutenant Barry and Corporal Sullivan advanced to accept the surrender, they were fired upon and killed. The remaining British soldiers launched a bayonet charge and took the airfield. Argentine troops were able to regroup on the outskirts of Goose Green, and despite making big gains, the British troops were now stretched, with B Company isolated, a situation made worse by the arrival of Argentinian reinforcements from nearby Kent Hill. Whilst the Argentinians were surrounded, their attackers were running low on supplies and ammunition. Reinforcements were on the way, but Keeble didn't want to leave the door open for an Argentinian counterattack. Instead, he proposed to ask the Argentinians to surrender or be bombarded by artillery and airstrikes, then attacked when reinforcements had arrived. Late in the evening, a message was sent to Piaggi, and after midnight, the Argentinian commander received a prisoner of war delegation to negotiate a surrender. After consultation with superiors, Piaggi reluctantly agreed. Had he not done so, he and his troops faced being pummeled by artillery fire, with no reasonable chance of victory. He was heavily criticised after the war and forced to resign from the army. Writing a book to answer his critics, he detailed why further resistance was futile. In 1992, after a long fight through the courts, he finally had his rank and pension restored. Keeble was awarded a DSO for his command of the battle, one of many to receive awards on both sides. Jones was posthumously awarded a Victoria Cross, though there was criticism from some that his actions in command at Goose Green had been reckless. Corporal David Abels was awarded a Distinguished Conduct Medal for a daring assault in which he fired a Laws rocket that knocked out sniper positions on Darwin Hill, decisively altering the course of the engagement. The battle for Goose Green was more symbolic than strategically important. The surrender of Argentine forces was a body blow to their military and a corresponding boost to the British. 50 miles away in Port Stanley, the Argentinians must have heard the distant drums, and a little more than 2 weeks later, they would be surrendering too. In May 1924, 2 wealthy students from the University of Chicago kidnapped and murdered a 14-year-old boy, Bobby Franks, in what was dubbed by the media as the crime of the century. The culprits, Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb, carried out the crime not because of psychopathy, but as an intellectual exercise. They believed that their superior intellect would allow them to commit the perfect crime, and that their motive absolved them of any guilt. Both men grew up in the affluent Kenwood neighborhood on Chicago's South Side. Both were seen as child prodigies, skipping grades in school, and were acknowledged polymaths. The two knew each other socially, but while at the University of Chicago, they discovered a mutual interest in crime, which cemented their friendship. Leopold was also a devoted follower of Nietzsche, the German philosopher, whose theory of superior men justifying the existence of the human race has been consistently misunderstood and twisted by people like the Nazis. He managed to convince Loeb that they were above the laws set out for ordinary men, and the two embarked on a minor crime spree of theft, vandalism, and breaking and entering to validate their theory. Moving on to more serious crimes such as arson, they were upset when a lack of local media attention for their antics failed to materialize. Seeking to have their Superman status confirmed beyond doubt, they set about planning the perfect crime. At the time, they were just 19 and 18 respectively. After months of careful consideration, the two decided on the kidnap and murder of an adolescent. In a sadistic subplot, for their own amusement, they devised a ransom demand, accompanied by a complex communication and delivery system, despite having no intention other than murder. The weapon to be used and disposal options had already been arranged. This done, Leopold and Loeb began stalking potential victims, mainly around the Harvard School for Boys in Kenwood. They eventually settled on 14-year-old Robert Bobby Franks, the son of a wealthy Chicago watchmaker. Loeb was the boy's second cousin and a neighbour, and Franks had even played tennis at the Loeb home. The plan was activated on the 21st of May 1924. Tailing Franks in a rented car on the boy's way home from school, Franks was persuaded to get into the car by Loeb to discuss a tennis racket. What happened next is not entirely clear, but it's believed that Leopold drove and Loeb struck Franks several times in the head with a chisel. With Franks dead and out of sight on the floorboard in the rear of the car, Leopold and Loeb drove to the prearranged spot near Wolf Lake in Indiana, 25 miles south of Chicago. There, at nightfall, they concealed Frank's body in a culvert and returned to Chicago. By the time they arrived, word was already out that Franks was missing. Leopold telephoned Frank's mother, calling himself George Johnson, and informing her that the boy had been kidnapped, and ransom instructions would follow. After mailing a ransom note, burning their clothing, and cleaning up the rented car, they settled down for an evening of card playing. The following morning, Leopold resumed calling the Franks' house, this time with the elaborate instructions for ransom delivery. When word arrived that Frank's body had been found, it put an end to his cruel baiting of the family. The two murderers destroyed the typewriter on which the ransom note was typed, and a blanket that had been in contact with the victim, then went about their lives as if nothing had happened. There's lots more to come in this video, but please consider liking, subscribing to the channel, and sharing. An intensive police investigation began, with a reward attached. For some reason, probably arrogance, Leopold began blabbing to reporters and sharing his theories with detectives. As with anyone who attempts to insert themselves into such an investigation, he became a suspect. Police were further interested when a pair of eyeglasses with a specific hinge, sold only to 3 customers in Chicago, was found at the murder scene. Leopold was one of those 3, and a lame excuse about possibly losing them during a bird-watching trip convinced no one. Leopold and Loeb were eventually summoned for formal questioning on the 29th of May. An alibi, claiming to have spent the night driving around with 2 women, whose names they couldn't remember, was demolished by Leopold's chauffeur, who informed police that Leopold's car was being repaired on that night, so could not have been used. Faced with these facts, Loeb abruptly confessed, blaming Leopold for everything, and stating that he was only driving the car. When Leopold confessed, he reversed their roles, but other than that, the details were broadly the same. Both admitted that it was a thrill kill, fueled by their delusions about Nietzsche's Superman, and the desire to commit the perfect crime. Leopold further admitted that the crime had not given him the fulfillment he hoped for. The trial was a media circus. Loeb's family hired the renowned criminal defense attorney, Clarence Darrow, at a cost of $70,000. Darrow took the case, as he was a staunch opponent of capital punishment. In the event, the trial was fairly unremarkable, since it was an open and shut case. Both men pleaded guilty, and sought mitigation in psychiatric or personality defects. The only memorable event was Darrow's summing up to the judge, 12 hours in all, in which he emphasized the youth of the defendants, the unfairness of the U.S. justice system, and basically laid it on thick. The judge, perhaps bludgeoned into submission by Darrow's speech, spared Leopold and Loeb from death, instead sentencing them to life plus 99 years for the kidnapping. 12 years later, Loeb was murdered in prison by another inmate, James Day, who claimed that Loeb had made advances towards him. The evidence seemed to suggest that it might have been the other way round, but with sympathy for Loeb in short supply, Day got away with his claim of self-defense. Leopold was a model prisoner, assisting in the education of other inmates, and participating in a trial for an experimental malaria treatment. He wrote his autobiography, entitled Life Plus 99 Years, published in 1958 as part of an ongoing campaign to win parole. Despite criticism for a perceived lack of remorse, he won his freedom that same year. With the help of a Christian charity, he moved to Puerto Rico, becoming a medical technician in a hospital. Earning a master's degree at the University of Puerto Rico, he taught classes and rekindled his interest in ornithology. He died of a heart attack in 1971, at the age of 66. There have certainly been more gruesome crimes than those committed by Leopold and Loeb, but the arrogance behind their thrill killing is the most unsettling part. Having seen off the fad for eugenics in the 1920s and the atrocious regime of Nazism in World War II, we must always be on our guard against the anti-human tendencies that lurk within some members of the human race.